It was a time when Israel was sinking into darkness. Following the death of King Solomon, God's chosen people had slowly begun to forget him under the rule of Ahab, the worst king Israel had ever seen. The blood of innocent prophets stained the Holy Land, hunted down and eliminated by his cruel wife Jezebel. Israel had forgotten the very name of God and instead knelt before altars of stone and wood. But God had not abandoned his people. Deep within the hills of Gilead, God was preparing an answer. From that forgotten, barren land emerged a man who would change history forever, Elijah. His very name held a promise of judgment and fire. My God is Yahweh. This is the story of the mightiest prophet who commanded the skies to close, called down fire from heaven itself, and never tasted death. But it is also the story of the man behind the prophet, his fears, his doubts, and his loneliness. Because Elijah was human, and his greatest battle wasn't against kings or armies, but against himself, against his own doubts and the loneliness that consumed him from within until it broke him. For many years, Elijah had lived in silence, hidden among the barren mountains. He was neither warrior nor priest. He wore garments made of camel hair, a thick beard covered his face, and his eyes burned with an otherworldly fire. But one day, God revealed to him his calling. The waiting was finally over. Elijah arose, descended from the mountains, and headed directly into the heart of corruption, Samaria, the capital city, where King Ahab ruled alongside Jezebel. The soldiers stationed at the palace gates, upon seeing him approach, froze in place, paralyzed by an unseen power, and let him pass, as if the air itself made way for him. Elijah walked through the throne room corridors, without announcement and without escort, servants retreating at each step. The columns of the palace, which had bowed to kings and ambassadors alike, now seemed to witness something entirely different. A wild prophet, no crown, no sword, striding forward as if driven by God himself. And there was Ahab, seated upon his throne, surrounded by counselors, idols, and vanity. Yet before he could even question who this stranger was, Elijah stood boldly before him and uttered words that would seal the kingdom's fate. As surely as the Lord lives, the God of Israel whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain during these years, except at my word. Silence fell like judgment. No one dared draw a breath. Elijah didn't wait for a response. He turned around abruptly and disappeared the way he had come. Ahab spoke not a word. He didn't order Elijah seized nor curse him. He just sat there, motionless, and then it began. Suddenly, the clouds started vanishing. The air turned dry, and the sky above began to close up, like a door sealed shut from on high. And as Elijah departed, God spoke to him again, saying, "Leave this place, go eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have commanded ravens to feed you there." Elijah obeyed without hesitation and headed east while the land dried up in his wake. The cool breeze ceased, and the dew, which had moistened the fields of Israel each morning, fell no more. The sun scorched the fields, and what once had been a proud and fertile nation began to wither. Judgment had already started, and for 3 long years, not a single drop of rain would touch the earth. But as the kingdom entered drought, Elijah traveled across hills and valleys until he found that hidden place, Cherith. The brook, Cherith, lay concealed between the dry hills near the Jordan, a thin ribbon of water slicing the earth like a scar, snaking its way among dry rocks and dusty bushes. Elijah settled into this hidden oasis, deep within the desert, where, with every sunrise and every sunset, a miracle unfolded. At dawn, as the sun began to stir in the east, a fluttering of wings would suddenly break the silence of the sky. Ravens, black-feathered birds, would appear along the horizon, carrying bread and meat in their beaks. They would settle near the prophet, place the food before him, and then, taking flight once more, vanish into the sky. They were birds considered unclean by law, creatures despised by men, yet these were the ones chosen by God to deliver nourishment morning and evening alike, when the hills were painted amber by the sun's fading light. In profound solitude, Elijah ate in silence and drank from the brook, watching days melt into weeks and weeks lengthen into months. And this drought, like a silent curse, spread its dark shadow over all of Israel. The wells ran dry, the fields became barren, and animals collapsed exhausted onto the cracked earth. From his throne, Ahab screamed orders in desperation to find the man responsible for his ruin, yet no news ever came. Elijah remained hidden by the brook, yet gradually he noticed something changing. The stones once submerged now emerged like islands along the riverbed. The once powerful current reduced to a thin trickle. The drought he himself had prophesied was finally reaching him. Until one morning, when he bent down to drink, he found no water, only the dampness between stones. The brook Cherith had dried up. But Elijah neither panicked nor complained. He simply held onto his faith and waited, until at last God's voice spoke clearly. "Arise, go to Zarephath in Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow there to care for you." The Lord was sending him into dangerous territory, to Zarephath, the very homeland of Jezebel, the queen who had vowed to wipe out all his prophets. But Elijah did not hesitate. He stood, wrapped his cloak around him tightly, and began walking. The journey was grueling. The sun relentlessly battered cracked fields and lifeless trees. The drought spared nothing, and all living things seemed bowed beneath the very judgment Elijah himself had proclaimed. When Elijah finally reached the gates of Zarephath, suddenly he saw her, a frail woman dressed in rags, picking up dry sticks, her face weary, her hands cracked, and her eyes defeated. Something deep within his spirit confirmed it. This was the widow. Elijah approached, his voice calm and his face weathered by the harsh sun and desert wind, and said, "Please, bring me a bit of water in a jar so I may drink." The woman, not yet knowing who he was, turned obediently. But before she could take another step, Elijah continued, "And please, bring me a piece of bread in your hand." Then she stopped, her eyes lowered, and with a trembling voice she replied, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread. All I have is a handful of flour in a jar, and a little oil left in a pitcher. I was gathering a few sticks to prepare one last meal for myself and my son. After that, we'll die." And there, in that still moment, another truth deeper than the drought itself was revealed. The crisis was not only in the skies, it had reached deep into hearts, robbing them of hope. Elijah responded gently, "Do not be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, bake a small cake of bread for me and bring it here. Then afterward, make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, nor will the pitcher of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth." The woman stared at him in silence. She faced a choice: cling desperately to the little she had left, or let go and trust. She could die with dignity, or obey and see what happened. She chose to believe, not in Baal, nor the idols of her people, nor even her own instincts. She chose to believe the word of a stranger, a dusty wanderer whose eyes seemed to have witnessed more than any man could bear. She returned home, lit the fire, poured the flour, mixed in the oil, and baked. And when she came back to the jar, the flour was still there, and the oil never ran dry. That day all three of them ate, she, her son, and Elijah, and again the next day and the next, and on, for many days. But suddenly the widow's son fell ill. At first, it was just a fever, then each breath grew shallower until, within hours, the child stopped breathing. The mother sank to her knees, broken from the inside out. The same man who had brought life into her household now seemed to have brought death. "Have you come to remind me of my sins?" she cried out to him in tears. "Have you come just to kill my son?" Elijah gave no response. He took the boy gently in his arms, carried him to the upstairs room where he had stayed, laid him upon the bed, and cried out to heaven. "My Lord and my God," Elijah cried, "have you brought calamity even upon this widow who welcomed me into her home by taking away her son?" Then he did something that no prophet had done before. Elijah stretched himself out 3 times over the boy, as if hoping to pour his own life into the child's body, and pleaded desperately, "O Lord my God, let this child's life return to him." There was a long silence, heavy, unbearable, until finally the boy's chest rose, his lips parted, and breath returned to his body. Elijah carried the living boy down the stairs, presented him to his mother, and said, "See, your son is alive." At that very instant, the widow regained more than her son. She regained her faith. With tears streaming down her face, she said, "Now I truly know that you are a man of God, and the words of the Lord from your lips are true." In a pagan land where altars burned for gods carved from stone and flame, a spark of true faith had now been lit. But still, the drought had not ended. For 3 whole years, not a drop of rain fell, and God's judgment had stretched across Israel like an open wound. Livestock vanished, wells dried up, and harvests became only a memory. First hunger struck the poor, but soon even the wealthy felt its bite. Yet in all that despair, not everyone bowed down to Baal. Among those steadfast few was Obadiah, King Ahab's steward, who had witnessed the king's cruelty but refused to stand by quietly. Amid Ahab's persecution and slaughter of the Lord's priests and prophets, Obadiah did the unthinkable. He hid 100 prophets of God in 2 caves, 50 in each, and secretly fed them bread and water. Every single day he risked his life out of love for his God. He even managed to keep it hidden from King Ahab, maintaining the king's trust. One morning, the king gave Obadiah an order: travel through the land, search for grass, springs, any stream not yet dried up. Perhaps we can save our horses and mules. Maybe something is still alive. Obadiah went out into the ruined kingdom, crossing barren and lifeless fields, when suddenly he saw him. There, amidst the dusty road, stood Elijah, tall, unwavering, his eyes burning like ancient fire. Obadiah fell to the ground and cried out, "Is that you, my lord Elijah?" "It is I," the prophet replied. "Go tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah stood up slowly. Fear stole his breath, and his eyes revealed his deep anguish. "What have I done that you'd put my life in danger? If I go and tell Ahab you're here, and then the Spirit of the Lord takes you somewhere else, and he can't find you, he'll kill me." Then Obadiah leaned closer and confessed his secret to Elijah. "I've served the Lord faithfully since my youth. When Jezebel went around killing the prophets, I hid 100 of them in caves and fed them myself. I've done everything I could, Elijah. And now you ask this of me?" But Elijah stood firm, replying, "As surely as the Lord of hosts lives whom I serve, I will stand before Ahab today." Obadiah knew he stood before a man who spoke as though heaven itself backed his words, and he obeyed. With his heart racing, he returned to the palace and spoke the words nobody expected to hear. "Elijah has returned." The prophet who sealed the heavens shut, who humbled the king before his very throne and vanished as quickly as he appeared, had finally returned. Without hesitation, Ahab got onto his chariot and set out toward the appointed place. The sun blazed over dry, barren fields the moment the 2 men met, and it was Ahab who broke the silence with disdain. "Is that you, troublemaker of Israel?" But Elijah met his gaze and replied firmly, "I'm not the one troubling Israel, but rather you and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commands of the Lord and have chosen to follow Baal." Then Elijah boldly issued the challenge, "Now summon all Israel to Mount Carmel. Bring along the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who dine at Jezebel's table. Today we will see who truly is God." Ahab agreed to the test, and the showdown began. The news spread quickly throughout all Israel, and thousands climbed from every corner of the kingdom toward Mount Carmel. Elders and youths, priests and soldiers, farmers and shepherds, no one wanted to miss what was about to happen. At the summit, tension filled the air. On one side stood nearly 1,000 prophets of Baal and Asherah, dressed in flashy robes and adorned with pagan symbols. On the other side stood Elijah alone, wrapped in a cloak worn thin by the sun and wind. The prophet raised his voice and sorrowfully asked the people, "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if it's Baal, then follow him." The crowd fell silent, as if shame itself had sealed their lips. Then Elijah stepped forward and declared the rules of the challenge. "I am the only prophet of the Lord left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Bring 2 bulls. They will choose 1 bull, cut it into pieces, and set it on the wood, but without lighting any fire. I will prepare the other bull, place it on the wood, and also not set fire to it. Then you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is the true God. The prophets of Baal went first. They prepared their altar, cut up their bull, and laid it upon the dry wood. Then began a gruesome spectacle. From morning until noon, the 450 prophets screamed, leaped, and danced wildly around their altar, calling out to Baal. But there was no reply, not even the slightest sign. Baal remained utterly and embarrassingly silent. The sun climbed to its highest point, and Elijah, observing the tragic scene, began mocking them sarcastically. Shout louder. Maybe Baal is busy or he's wandered off somewhere. Perhaps he's sleeping and you need to wake him up. In wild desperation, they screamed even louder, intensifying their grim performance by cutting themselves until blood flowed freely. Afternoon drifted slowly across Mount Carmel, yet still no answer came. No fire descended. The crowd began to whisper, and Baal's powerlessness was made clear before the eyes of all Israel. Now it was Elijah's turn. Weary and disappointed, the people gathered close around him. Silently, Elijah took 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, and rebuilt the broken altar of the Lord. Carefully, he arranged the wood and placed the sacrifice upon it. Then he asked the impossible in the midst of the drought, commanding them to bring 4 jars full of water and pour it over the sacrifice. They did it once, then twice, and finally a third time, until the altar was thoroughly soaked and water filled the trench surrounding it. Then, standing before all the people, the prophet lifted his eyes toward heaven and cried out, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let them see today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that all I have done has been at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people may know you alone are God, and that you are drawing their hearts back to you." A brief yet profound silence followed his prayer. Suddenly, fire blazed from heaven, a scorching flame, alive and fierce, that consumed the sacrifice instantly, along with the wood, the stones, even the water itself, leaving behind only dust and reverent silence. Falling to their knees, the people acknowledged the true God, crying out in awe, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" At that moment, there was no doubt. Yahweh had answered, not Baal. Elijah's spiritual authority was unmistakably proven, and the crowd finally understood that the drought had come as a direct consequence of abandoning the Lord. The truth shone brighter than ever atop Mount Carmel. The prophet then turned his gaze toward Baal's false prophets, whose arrogance now lay in ashes, and commanded they be seized. They were taken down to the Kishon brook, where the judgment once ordained by God in ancient times was carried out, the execution of all those who had led Israel astray into idolatry. The land of Israel at last had begun to be purified. As the people watched this decisive moment unfold, Elijah suddenly felt something in his spirit that he hadn't sensed in 3 years, the distant whisper of coming rain. A sound no one else could yet hear, but one the prophet knew would soon be obvious to everyone. The prophet then authoritatively addressed King Ahab, "Prepare your chariot and head down immediately, for I hear the roar of an approaching storm." Ahab raised his eyes, seeing a sky as dry and clear as it had been for the past 3 years. But he obeyed nonetheless. The drought had served its purpose, and now God stood ready to open the heavens once again and pour out his mercy. Then Elijah climbed once more to the mountain and began to pray fervently, determined with the faith of someone who truly knows the God he serves. Beside him stood his servant, awaiting instructions. "Go up and look toward the sea," Elijah ordered. The young man ran, looked, returned, and answered breathlessly, "There's nothing there." Elijah remained still, and with firm conviction insisted, "Go back and look again." The servant went a second time and saw nothing. He went a third time, a fourth. 6 times he returned with the same news. "I see nothing, sir." Yet Elijah refused to quit. He continued pouring out his heart, knowing God was not finished yet. The 7th time the young servant ran back excitedly, exclaiming in wonder, "Now I see a small cloud rising from the sea, no larger than the palm of a hand." For Elijah, that was enough. He quickly stood up and commanded with urgency, "Go tell Ahab to hitch up his chariot and hurry down before the rain stops him." In just a few minutes, that small cloud grew larger. The sky quickly turned dark, and from the horizon came a powerful wind. The people lifted their eyes in awe. After 3 long years, heavy drops began to fall upon the dry land. Within moments, the gentle drizzle transformed into a torrential downpour, soaking the thirsty earth and forming new streams rushing through the cracked and barren ground. Ahab quickly climbed onto his chariot and started down toward Jezreel, driven onward by the heavy rain now saturating everything around him. But then something extraordinary happened. The hand of the Lord came upon Elijah. The prophet tucked his cloak into his belt and began to run, not as an ordinary man would, but with supernatural speed, propelled forward by the very power of God. Before the king's astonished eyes, the prophet outran the horses, running through the storm as if carried by the rushing wind itself. It was an image of incredible power. The man who had closed the heavens now running ahead of the king, clearly displaying who truly ruled over Israel, not Ahab, nor Jezebel, nor Baal, but Yahweh, the living God, who commands the rains and seasons. Yet this rainfall was more than mere water. It was a profound lesson. God answers those who pray persistently. He did not respond at Elijah's first attempt, nor his second, nor even his 6th. God answered only after Elijah continued to pray faithfully, trusting fully in the promise he had received. The drought had finally ended, and the people experienced the mercy they'd long awaited. But the battle was just beginning. Even as the rain poured abundantly upon Israel, an enraged woman brooded inside the palace, preparing Elijah to soon face the greatest test of his life. In the palace at Jezreel, Jezebel received the news. Elijah had humiliated her prophets, destroyed her priests, and now the people themselves were beginning to turn against her. Her face twisted into an expression of fury. She sent a messenger to the prophet bearing a threat that was more than a mere warning. It was a promise of death. "May the gods punish me severely if by this time tomorrow I don't do to you exactly what you did to each of them." When Elijah heard these words, fear gripped his heart, darker and deeper than he'd ever known. The very prophet who had bravely stood before hundreds on Mount Carmel and called down fire from heaven now trembled before one woman's wrath. Without thinking, without seeking God's counsel, he fled. He ran southward, leaving behind the very people who had just begun to return to God, leaving behind his appointed mission, blinded completely by fear. He passed through fields and mountains, never stopping, never looking back, like a man pursued by death itself. At last, he reached the wilderness, alone and utterly exhausted. There, under the thin shade of a broom tree, the prophet collapsed to the ground. With tears he could no longer hold back, he cried out bitterly toward heaven, "Enough, Lord! Take my life now, for I am no better than my ancestors." Those words burst forth from the deepest part of his soul. Elijah, the great prophet, had reached rock bottom. All his strength, faith, and courage seemed to have evaporated under the ruthless heat of the desert. And there, beneath the sparse shade of the tree, he wished only to close his eyes forever. It wasn't merely Jezebel's threat that had broken him, but also the unbearable loneliness, the heavy burden of feeling he alone was faithful, and the deep disappointment that after all his struggles, nothing appeared to have changed. Yet there, deep in the desert, in the darkest moment of his life, God did not abandon him. Suddenly, a gentle hand touched him softly. Elijah slowly opened his weary eyes and saw beside him an angel who spoke with tenderness yet firmness. "Get up and eat." Elijah looked around and saw freshly baked bread cooking over hot coals and a jar of fresh water. He ate and drank, but the weight upon his heart still felt too heavy. Again he drifted into sleep, hoping to escape his pain once more. But the angel returned once more, patiently and compassionately touched him, and spoke again in a calm but firm voice. "Get up and eat, for you still have a long journey ahead." These words echoed deeply within Elijah's weary heart. The prophet, who had fled in despair, now moved toward an even closer, deeper encounter with God. There, upon that mountain, at the same spot where centuries earlier God had spoken face to face with Moses, Elijah would discover something new. For Elijah was human, deeply, profoundly human. Although God had used him to accomplish incredible miracles, and even though he had witnessed impossible wonders, he now faced a reality far tougher to confront: his own frailty, his humanity. Yet, amid that broken human condition, God was merciful to him, because even the people of God grow tired. They too suffer and doubt. Under that broom tree, Elijah came to understand that God doesn't only use people who are strong. Instead, he lifts up those who are broken. For in our deepest weakness, God's greatest works begin. That meal gave Elijah an unexplainable strength. He stood up and began his journey toward Horeb. Empowered by that nourishment, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights, crossing the scorching desert until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, where he would speak with him face to face. Elijah arrived at Mount Horeb, the sacred mountain where centuries before God had given Moses the stone tablets of the law. Now exhausted and broken, Elijah entered a dark cave seeking shelter from the harsh wind. And there, in the deep solitude of that cave, God spoke directly to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" With a face still hidden in anguish, the prophet answered from the depths of his wounded heart, "I have been deeply zealous for you, Lord, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I am the only one left alive, and now they want to kill me as well." Elijah's voice sounded fragile and weary, like that of a man who had struggled alone far too long. But God answered without reproach, simply inviting him to step out of the cave and stand upon the mountain, because the Lord himself was about to pass by. Suddenly, a fierce wind arose, so powerful that it tore the rocks apart and shook the entire mountain. Elijah clung tightly to the stone walls, but the Lord was not in that violent wind. Then came an earthquake, shaking the ground beneath his feet. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake appeared a blazing fire, lighting up the mountain with burning intensity, but the Lord was not in the fire either. And then calm arrived. An absolute silence wrapped around the mountain. Out of that silence came something entirely different, a gentle whisper, barely audible, like a soft breeze gently brushing against the skin. Hearing that quiet whisper, Elijah knew God was there. He covered his face with his cloak, stepped slowly out of the cave, and stood at the entrance. In that gentle whisper was the same powerful voice that had created the universe, but now it spoke with the tenderness of a father, comforting his weary child. With infinite patience, God asked again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet repeated his complaint once more, yet this time, in the heavenly whisper, something inside him began to heal. God did not accuse him nor reject him. Instead, he gave him a new purpose. He spoke clearly, with renewed authority, "Go back the way you came. You will anoint Hazael king over Syria, Jehu king over Israel, and Elisha to replace you as prophet." Then he revealed something deeper, something Elijah had never known. "I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, 7,000 who have not bowed their knees to Baal or kissed his idols." As he listened to these words, the prophet's heart again began to beat strongly. He was not alone. He had never been alone. God had preserved a faithful remnant, hidden and protected, waiting for just the right moment to come forward. Their ministry, their purpose, had not been in vain. Elijah came down from Mount Horeb with renewed heart and clear purpose. He was no longer the same man who had once asked for death beneath the broom tree. Now he walked with steady steps, understanding that his story was not finished and that he would not finish it alone. God had given him clear directions, whom to anoint, whom to prepare. Among those names, one stood out with special purpose: Elisha, son of Shaphat. And so he went to the fields where Elisha worked with his own hands. Elisha was neither priest nor prophet. He was a farmer. He was plowing the ground with 12 yoke of oxen, guiding the 12th himself. His hands were toughened by labor, his cloak covered in dust, his back bent from daily toil. But God had noticed him. Elijah approached him silently, removed his cloak, and placed it onto Elisha. This simple gesture spoke volumes. It was the unmistakable sign of divine calling, the passing of holy purpose, and the beginning of a new destiny. Elisha stopped. He felt the weight of the cloak resting upon his shoulders and instantly realized what it meant. In that moment, he knew his life had changed forever. He ran after Elijah, asking for one final act of compassion. "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will follow you." Without emotion or pressure, Elijah replied, "Go back then. Don't you realize what I've just done to you?" Then something radical happened. Elisha returned to the fields, but not to stay. He took the yoke of oxen he'd been working with and slaughtered them. Then he took the plow, the wood and the tools of his trade, and set them ablaze. Upon this makeshift altar, he cooked the meat and shared it with the people in his village. He burned his past. He left nothing to return to. He gave himself no excuses, no safety net. He left everything behind and followed Elijah. And from that day forward, Elisha became his servant. Years had passed since the fire on Mount Carmel, and the people of Israel seemed to have forgotten the warning. Israel returned to its old routines, and Ahab, despite having seen the power of God firsthand, continued to rule as if nothing had changed. He remained a weak king, controlled by a ruthless woman, Jezebel. In Samaria, Ahab had everything a king could wish for: palaces, gardens, gold, servants. Yet, deep inside, his heart coveted something more. Next to his palace lived a righteous man named Naboth. His vineyard wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was the inheritance of his ancestors. Ahab's heart desired it from the first moment he saw it. Approaching Naboth with a false smile, he offered money or an even better vineyard in exchange. But Naboth refused firmly, saying, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." Ahab returned to his palace like a spoiled child. He lay down on his bed, turned his face toward the wall, and refused to eat. His greed had wounded his pride, and his weakness filled him with bitterness. When Jezebel saw his misery, she scornfully asked, "Are you or are you not the king of Israel? Get up, eat, and cheer up. I will get Naboth's vineyard for you." And she did. With cold cruelty, she wrote letters in the king's name, sealed them with his royal seal, proclaimed a fast, and had Naboth seated in a place of honor. But next to him, two wicked men took their seats and, before the entire gathering, falsely accused Naboth. "Naboth has cursed God and the king." Without trial or defense, Naboth was dragged outside the city and stoned to death. His crime, standing up for what belonged to him. When the news reached Jezebel, she smiled with satisfaction and told Ahab, "Get up and seize the vineyard. Naboth is no longer alive." Ahab went to admire his new land, pleased like a spoiled child, believing he had won. But as he wandered through the vineyard, Elijah suddenly appeared, his face hardened with judgment. The king trembled at his sight and asked, "So you have found me, my enemy?" Elijah replied without hesitation, "Yes, I have found you, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." And once again Elijah delivered judgment, proclaiming, "Thus says the Lord, in the same place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, they will also lick up yours. I will bring disaster upon you, wiping out your descendants and destroying your lineage, just as I did with Jeroboam. Jezebel, your wife, will be devoured by dogs beside the wall of Jezreel, and anyone from your household who dies in the city will be eaten by dogs, and those who die in the open fields will be consumed by the birds of the air." Ahab's face grew pale. For the first time, Elijah's voice seemed to him not that of an enemy, but that of a judge. And this time, Ahab did not shout or curse, nor did he call for his soldiers. He tore his garments, put on sackcloth, began fasting, and lay down silently, refusing to eat. He walked slowly with his face bowed down in tears. From heaven, God saw this and spoke to Elijah once again, saying, "Because Ahab has humbled himself before me, I will not bring disaster during his lifetime, but rather, in the days of his son, I will bring calamity upon his household." Ahab had been warned. He would pay a heavy price for the idolatry and corruption he had sown throughout all Israel. Yet years passed, and Ahab thought perhaps God had forgotten his judgment. He was mistaken. He decided to wage war to reclaim the city of Ramoth Gilead from Syrian control. Even Even though a prophet warned him that he would surely die, Ahab ignored God's voice. He disguised himself, believing he could outsmart destiny. But an arrow, shot at random, pierced through his armor, striking exactly at its weakest point. As the battle raged on, Ahab lay quietly bleeding inside his chariot until finally died at sunset. And when they washed his chariot, dogs licked up his blood, just as Elijah had prophesied. Thus died Ahab, the worst king Israel had ever known, and his son Ahaziah took his place on the throne. It wasn't long before Ahaziah followed the same corrupt path his parents had paved, and one day Ahaziah fell through a lattice from an upper window of his palace in Samaria. Seriously injured and bedridden, the young king made a decision that would seal his fate. Rather than calling upon the God of Israel, he sent messengers to Ekron, a Philistine city, to consult Baal-zebub, the pagan god of flies and disease. But God had seen this and instructed Elijah, "Arise and intercept the king of Samaria's messengers and say to them, 'Is there no God in Israel that you must go consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron?' Therefore the Lord says this, 'You will not leave the bed you lie on, but will surely die.'" Elijah obeyed, and the message quickly reached the palace. Surprised, Ahaziah asked them, "What kind of man was it who came to meet you?" They answered, "He was a man wearing a garment of hair with a leather belt around his waist." And Ahaziah knew immediately. It was Elijah the Tishbite. The king's anger blazed, and he sent a captain with 50 soldiers to arrest him. They found the prophet sitting calmly atop a hill, and the captain shouted arrogantly, "Man of God, the king commands you to come down." But Elijah replied quietly, "If I truly am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men. And then it happened. A roar tore through the heaven, flames fell and consumed the captain and his soldiers in an instant. Their cries faded, reduced to ashes. Ahaziah, stubborn in his rebellion, sent another captain with another 50 men. The result was the same: fire, judgment, death. Yet the third captain was different. He came without orders or threats. He fell to his knees, lifted his hands and pleaded, "Man of God, I beg you, please let my life and the lives of these 50 servants of yours be precious in your sight." And this time, the voice of God spoke to Elijah. "Go down with him. Do not be afraid." The prophet arose and went down with the third captain to the palace. With authority, he stood before Ahaziah's bedside, reaffirming what had already been declared. "Thus says the Lord, because you sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, as if there were no God in Israel, you shall not rise from the bed you lie on. You shall surely die." And so it was. Ahaziah died, just as the word of the Lord had spoken through the mouth of his prophet. With him fell yet another link in the line of Ahab, under the full weight of divine judgment. Ahaziah's death marked the end of a generation. He left no son to occupy his throne, and the house of Ahab began to crumble like a wall cracked from within. Yet even as judgment unfolded inside the palace walls, something sacred stirred along the roads. For now Elijah himself was preparing to depart, not toward death, but toward eternity. Elijah knew the end had come. His spirit, attuned by years of listening closely to God's voice, sensed it with absolute clarity. His time on earth was finished, but his farewell would not happen in silence, nor would he face it alone. From Gilgal, the prophet began his final journey. Elijah arose early that morning. The desert breeze felt gentler than usual, and the sun had not yet fully risen, but already Elijah had set out on his journey. Beside him walked Elisha, his student, his successor, the young man who had left everything behind just to follow him, and from that day onward had not spent even a single day away from his side. At every stop, Elijah was testing Elisha's heart. When they reached the entrance to the promised land, Elijah told him, "Stay here, Elisha, because the Lord has sent me on to Bethel." But Elisha didn't hesitate. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as surely as you yourself live, I will never leave you." And so they continued walking together. At Bethel, the group of prophets came out to meet them. They pulled Elisha aside and quietly asked, "Do you know the Lord is going to take your master away from you today?" Elisha simply nodded. "Yes, I know. Be silent." They journeyed on, and once again Elijah said to him, "Stay here, "Because the Lord now sends me to Jericho." But Elisha's answer didn't change. He refused to leave his side. So they came to Jericho, the city known for miracles of old and fallen walls. Here again, the group of prophets approached Elisha and repeated their solemn warning. But Elisha, in sorrowful silence, replied once more, "Yes, I know. Be silent." At last they reached the Jordan, the sacred river. It was the threshold separating the human realm from the divine. 50 prophets watched them from afar, witnesses to a moment destined for eternity. Then Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the waters. Immediately the waters parted. Just like in the days of Moses, the currents pulled back, splitting apart left and right, opening a dry path for the two men to cross over safely. At that moment, Elijah stopped. He knew his journey was coming to an end, yet he couldn't depart without first passing on his legacy. He turned to Elisha and said solemnly, "Ask whatever you'd like me to do for you before I am taken away." Without hesitation, Elisha boldly asked for the impossible. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elijah studied him intently, fully aware of the boldness, the faith, and the burden behind such a request. "You've asked something difficult," he replied. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be granted." They continued on together in silence as the sun began its descent, when suddenly the heavens opened. A whirlwind surged from the heavens, sands swirling madly, winds roaring with supernatural strength. And there appeared something astonishing, a chariot of fire, pulled by flaming horses, descending like a blazing arrow from above. With powerful gusts, the whirlwind swept Elijah up, wrapped in fire, embraced by glory. Elisha cried out with the anguish of a son, but there was no one left. Elijah had been taken into heaven without tasting death. His cloak drifted slowly to the earth, gently touching the ground. Elisha picked it up, hands trembling, forever changed. It was a witness, a sign that the Spirit who had once empowered the fiery prophet now rested upon him. He returned to the Jordan, the same river they'd crossed together earlier. Striking the waters with his mentor's cloak, he shouted, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And once again the Jordan parted. Watching prophets bowed in reverence. They no longer saw Elisha as a mere servant, for now the spirit of Elijah rested upon him. Elijah had ascended, yet his fire hadn't gone out. It had merely changed hands. That day at the crossing of the Jordan, the prophetic legacy lived on. Though Elijah himself had departed, his word remained. God had not forgotten the promise of judgment against the house of Ahab, nor the innocent blood shed in Naboth's vineyard. And now, in the days of Elisha, that promise would rise with relentless power. Judgment was already on its way, and when the moment was right, God lifted up Jehu, a commander in Israel's army, a fierce warrior, resolute, determined, and fearless. Then the Lord spoke through Elisha, giving clear instructions. He sent a young prophet into the military encampment where Jehu was stationed. The prophet poured oil upon Jehu's head and proclaimed, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I anoint you king over the Lord's people, over Israel. You will strike down the house of Ahab, avenging the blood of my servants, the prophets. For the entire house of Ahab will perish. Not a single male will survive. As for Jezebel, the dogs will devour her body in Jezreel, and no one will bury her." Before Jehu could even reply, the young prophet vanished like a whisper into the shadows. Jehu walked back out to his men, his head dripping with oil and fire blazing in his eyes. His companions watched him expectantly. What did that madman want? What did he say to you? Jehu hesitated at first, but then, gazing resolutely into their eyes, spoke boldly. "He has anointed me king over Israel." Immediately they rose up, each man laying his garment beneath Jehu's feet as a sign of allegiance. And blowing their trumpets, they shouted loudly, "Jehu is king." And at that moment, the revolution began. Suddenly, Jehu leapt onto his war chariot and raced toward Jezreel like a whirlwind. First, Jehu headed directly to the field of Naboth, the same ground Jezebel had stolen after murdering that righteous man so she could gift it to her husband, Ahab. There he found Joram, Ahab's second son, and now king of Israel, along with Ahaziah, king of Judah, who was visiting at the time. Without hesitation, Jehu drew back his bow and shot an arrow straight through Joram's heart, declaring, Right here, on Naboth's own land, the Lord repays you. The king's body fell at the exact spot where Naboth had been murdered. Ahaziah tried to run, but didn't get very far. He was struck down by Jehu's men and collapsed at Megiddo. The prophecy had been fulfilled down to the last detail, but justice wasn't finished yet. One name still remained: Jezebel. The queen was in her palace at Jezreel, and when she learned Jehu was approaching, she prepared herself. She painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and watched from her window as Jehu appeared in the distance. "Have you come in peace, Zimri, you murderer of your master?" she mocked him, shouting from her palace window. Jehu looked up and called out to the people below, "Who will stand with me?" 2 or 3 officials appeared at the window, and Jehu commanded them, "Throw her down, toss her out." And so they shoved her out the window. Jezebel's body plunged from above, crashing onto the ground. Her blood splattered against the walls, and the horses trampled over her mercilessly. Later, Jehu ordered her to be buried, but when they went to retrieve her body, it was nowhere to be found. Only fragments remained, pieces of her feet and the palms of her hands. The dogs had devoured her, exactly as Elijah had prophesied. And thus was fulfilled the word of the Lord. Ahab's household was utterly destroyed. His children, his allies, his priests, all fell beneath Jehu's sword, carrying out the divine judgment. But Jehu did not stop there. One by one, each of Ahab's offspring was executed. All 70 descendants were beheaded. Next came the servants, the counselors, the false prophets, and everyone connected to the throne in Samaria. In a single campaign, Jehu completely wiped out the household of Ahab. Every word of God's judgment was fulfilled without exception. The blood of the prophets had finally been avenged, and Elijah's legacy, even after he had ascended into heaven, continued to burn like fire upon the land. For although Elijah's physical presence no longer walked the earth, his spirit had not vanished. And centuries later, a new prophecy arose, spoken from the lips of the last prophet before the great silence, Malachi. "See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." 6. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children, and the hearts of the children to their parents. Or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. He wasn't speaking of the Elijah from times past, but of an Elijah yet to come, of a prophetic spirit who would once again stir sleeping hearts, call for truth amid complacency, and prepare the way for judgment and restoration. It was a declaration. Before the end, Elijah would return. Before the glorious and terrifying day of the Lord, a voice like his, a calling like his, would be heard once more. It wasn't just a promise, it was a warning. This means the story of Elijah, the prophet who never died, is still not over. According to Scripture, he will come again, and when he does, the world must be ready. From Elijah, we learn that God also walks with us and holds us up when we break. We learn that even the bravest fall, that even the most faithful servants sometimes feel fear, and that even prophets can feel alone, empty, and close to collapse. And now this story calls out to you. Yes, you. Perhaps you've journeyed through doubts, fears, or moments of profound spiritual exhaustion. Have you ever felt like the struggle is just too much, like you're alone, like the world around you has forgotten God? Maybe you, just like Elijah, have felt the urge to hide under a broom tree, wishing to simply give up. Listen closely. God isn't finished with you yet. When Elijah was exhausted and had no strength left, God didn't abandon him, nor did he scold him for falling down. Instead, he fed him, touched him, and strengthened him, and afterwards, he spoke to him again. Maybe you're in that same place right now, wounded inside and weary. Today, God is calling you, because if there's one thing we learn from Elijah, it's that God doesn't pick the perfect. He chooses the willing, the ones who listen in faith. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's wrestling with doubts or feeling alone, share this video with them. It just may be exactly what they need today. Please support this video by giving it a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more life-changing Bible stories coming soon. Blessings to you and your family.